Hey everybody, Shelby here from Designer Tool Belt. Today's video, I'm going to show you how to pour an exterior kitchen concrete countertop start to finish, from framing to pour. Hit the subscribe button for more tips, tricks, and videos on how to become the ultimate DIYer. At the end, a cost analysis of the project. Let's see what we're looking at.
Now, before we get to framing and pouring the concrete countertop, we're going to cut out all the holes that we need. So we have a bar sink, and I'm just measuring out that bar sink, and then we're going to cut that hole out, and then we'll get to the framing. So you want to make sure that any holes that you have cut in it are cut before we do the framing of the top. Now that we've got our bar sink traced on the wood of our countertop, we'll go ahead and use the circular saw to cut out that opening. Be sure to include whatever the dimensions are of the sink, plus the flange, plus maybe an inch more, a half inch more. There's no specific beyond that, because we can actually correct that with the framing of the sink opening, but ensure that it is larger than the actual sink itself. Now that the sink hole and the grill hole are cut out from the top, we'll make a level line, approximately 1 inch down, and this is going to be where our ledger sits. The ledger is going to hold up the framing for the actual concrete countertop while we pour it. You can use really any type of wood, scrap wood that you have as the ledger. I've screwed in 2x2s, and they don't have to be completely 100% all the way around. You could have some gaps, as in my scenario here, but we want to make sure that it does go around the whole entire perimeter, as that'll hold down the bottom shelf of the form. Now that the ledger is in place, we're going to cut 3/4 inch melamine to be the bottom of the form and the sides of the form. And we'll continue all the way around, cutting the base so that it's completely continuous. The melamine works great because it has a very slick surface. It'll pull away from the concrete after it dries very easily. Concrete will not adhere to it, and you'll get a nice smooth finish. So cut your melamine at approximately 2 1/4 inches. If you would like a 1 3/4 inch depth countertop, I've cut mine at 2 1/4 and then 2 1/4 high. So it's going to be 2 1/4, and then we'll put the 3/4 inches against it. So that's going to result in a 1 1/2 inch out from the grill, which will be easily held up by our ledger. And then I'll attach the 2 1/4 again to the top of that. So the thickness of the countertop itself in this scenario is going to be 2 1/4, and it's going to be 1 1/2 inches out from the actual structure. You can use screws or nails to attach this. Either way, it really doesn't matter. We will be pulling away the forms and tossing it all out as scrap. I've used a pneumatic nailer, as that's very quick and easy to hold, and it won't jump like a screw on a drill. Now that you've framed the perimeter of your concrete countertop, we're going to frame the grill surround. So we'll measure back, and then we will leave just a bit of overhang. So we will do a bottom and a side to this, so that we have concrete exposure on all sides of this grill surround. Using a pneumatic nailer, I'll use a piece on top that is also melamine. This is going to hold the sides of that grill opening in place so that we can pour, and then we can remove those as we pour. This way, the pressure of the concrete being poured into the forms does not affect the squareness of the opening for the grill itself. You could use any scraps that you have for this. Could extend a couple inches past the forms. It really doesn't matter. This is really just a temporary hold as we pour the concrete in so that nothing shifts, because the weight of concrete is surprisingly way more than you think, especially when water is added to the dry compound, and it can force forms out of where you want them to be. Now that we've framed in the grill, we'll frame in the kitchen sink. So we'll just give it another double check on the measures to make sure that we have included the opening plus the flange, because this is an undermount sink. And then we will build our frame, which is going to be smaller than that opening, because the inside edges of this frame are actually going to be the exposed inside of the sink itself. Since it's undermount, you may want to make this a bit smaller, maybe 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 of an inch, so that there is enough room for water to roll over into the sink and not just hit the sink flange. Once we have the square made for the sink itself, we're going to build the base that is going to fill this area here so that we have a smooth bottom for which the sink flange is going to mount to the underside of the concrete. So if we were to make the sink square the same exact size as the sink opening, we wouldn't be able to adhere it to the underside. We'd be adhering it to the top of the wood. So now we are going to put this insert in. We'll have a nice smooth concrete finish all the way around the underside, and we'll be able to adhere a sink to the underside of it. You can use a couple nailers on the bottom of the plywood screwed to the plywood that'll hold this up temporarily. We will be breaking this down immediately after pouring. To hold it in place, use a couple more scraps that'll span across the top of your forms. And you could use a pneumatic nailer or drill to keep that in place, but that'll be helpful so that it doesn't drop down. Well, now that we have our pouring done, we're going to use caulking to do a nice round corner at all of our seams. So wherever the melamine meets each other, we're going to use caulking. And this caulking, you can rub with your finger to get a nice round edge. This will help during or after the pouring process to have a smooth edge that's not sharp and it'll cut your fingers and or flake off. So go all the way around the entire perimeter of the grill form, as well as any of the areas where forms are meeting. So in this case, we have melamine meeting the OSB top. So we'll want to fill that in, because if we don't, while we're pouring, water is going to escape down through those areas, those cracks, and our concrete is going to dry much faster in that specific area and could cause cracking. Once we've completed the caulking and let it dry, approximately a half hour or so, we're going to apply an elastomeric sealant. This sealant is what's going to create a universal surface for the concrete to bond to, as we are bonding melamine, OSB, and concrete in this scenario. So once we spread this on, which it'll dry in approximately an hour maximum, we will have a latex barrier in which we are pouring this concrete onto. So we won't have any excessive moisture absorption in one area in particular that'll cause a lack of water in the concrete that will cause unnecessary cracking. So you'll want to do a thick layer across all surfaces, but don't do the surfaces that are going to be exposed. So we don't want to do the sides of the forms or the sides of the grill form, anything that would be seen from the outside. This is mainly just an underside application. You could use any brush for this, and it is rather thick, so you want to work pretty quickly on it, as it'll dry rather quickly and get kind of tacky and harder to work with. Now that we have our elastomeric sealer on the entire surface of our countertop, we're going to put in the wire remesh. I like 6 or 8 inch on center wire remesh. You can buy it in a 4x8 sheet, lay it into place, and then use either snips or an angle grinder with an abrasive blade to cut it. Cut the mesh 1 inch or more away from the edge of the concrete countertop forms, as any moisture that gets into the concrete itself can cause this to rust, and if it's too close to the edge, can cause some rust to bleed through to the outside of your countertop, and that's not going to be a good look that you're going for. You can splice it here and there, as we'll do some overlaps. It doesn't really necessarily matter if you have any specific amount of overlap between the remesh pieces as you continue along your countertop, but you do want to make sure that the whole entire area has remesh, and then we will do some corners in a bit that are going to be secured by rebar, as those areas are more likely to crack. Now that all the remesh is installed, we'll get to those areas that are prone to cracking. So this would be anywhere where the concrete countertop is less than 4 inches in width, and or coming off a corner of, say, a column to another corner, or a sink to the edge. Anywhere where it would be less than 4 inches, and or there could be flex between materials. In this case, we have block columns and then a wood frame for the remainder of the structure. Those areas with the weight of the concrete are prone to cracking. So we will use 3/8 inch rebar and bend it around any of the corners. And we'll overlap this approximately a foot into the remesh that is ensuring that the remainder of our countertop does not crack. So we'll do this around all of the columns, as well as in front and behind the sink. And you can just span it across. It doesn't need to be tied to the remesh itself, but having that piece of rebar there will be helpful to deter any cracking during the curing process of the concrete. We'll put another one on the back side of the last column. 3/8 inch rebar is plenty strong enough, as most countertops, concrete wise anyway, are only between 1.5 inches and 3 inches thick. So 3/8 inch rebar is more than enough to handle that. As we wrap it around the column, again, ensure that the rebar is kept at least 1 inch away from the edge of the forms to prevent from rust bleeding through with moisture. With the forms set, we'll now begin to put in the concrete. Mix up the concrete with a wheelbarrow, a gas-powered or electric mixer. It really doesn't matter. In this case, we're using 5,000 psi gray concrete with no colorant added. So we've used a wheelbarrow to mix it. If you were to use colored concrete, you would want to use a gas-powered or electric mixer to ensure that you have consistent color throughout. Once you have got a good amount of concrete in the area, use a piece of wood to screed it back and forth along the top of the forms. We'll want to pay extra attention to getting into the edges or the corners of the forms. Keep working your way around. You want to screed back and forth from the top of the forms, And then any excess you could sweep off with a trowel and push it onto the next area. Ensure that you don't leave any cold joints. A cold joint would be an area where concrete has been stopped completely and set for a while, and then new concrete poured on top. So as it's wet, hit the edge of the forms with a hammer and just tap them lightly but consistently all the way around the perimeter of the forms. This is going to release the air that is trapped in the edge of the forms. And this will give you that smooth finish with less pock marks when you take the forms off. Pock marks will end up creating extra work with the Portland that you'll have to mix to smooth them out. So take the time with that. After you've tapped out that first area and gotten all of the air bubbles out, continue to screed with a piece of melamine preferably, because that is non-stick. But you'll want to work your way around the whole entire concrete countertop, backfilling wherever areas seem to be too low. So wear some gloves because this concrete will dry out your fingers, and you want to make sure that you do not skimp on concrete in any area, as when it dries, it will contract and the area that is low will become more obvious. So as we work our way around, we'll pay attention to pushing with a trowel the concrete into the edges to make sure that those areas are relieved of any air bubbles or any air gaps. This is where it becomes very important that the forms were set correctly and securely, as you're going to be applying pressure in addition to the pressure of the concrete and the weight of the concrete. But we want to ensure that any and all areas have had as much air as possible pressed out of them so that it's one solid slab of concrete. And just keep on screeding the concrete down and don't create a cold joint. We'll have continuous concrete flow, and in the end project, we're going to have an even drying, non-cracking concrete countertop. After the concrete countertop is poured, go back around and tap the edge of the perimeter of forms with a hammer to get the remainder of all the air gaps out, or as many as you can. And this will cut down on all the patching you're going to have to do with Portland at a later stage. Once your concrete countertop is dried, approximately 24 hours, you can remove the forms. And then I like to use a little sander just to take off the rough edges on the corners, as there will be some buildup. If you've used a corner trowel, there won't be any buildup, but in this way we went with a straight edge, so there's some buildup. We knock those down and then wet the countertop in preparation of polishing it. The first stage of polishing is only going to be a 400 grit. You'll use a variable polisher, and this is only going to take down any little lumps, any little pieces of aggregate that are sticking out the top. You want to use plenty of water and only use it at a mid-speed. So you don't want to go and polish it completely at this point with a high speed. So use a low speed and just go back and forth, back and forth. This is going to remove any of that grit, but it's also going to put some of the Portland that is from the original countertop smeared back into any pockets or hollow areas that appear after any aggregate is removed. Once you've got the first plane across sanded out with the angle grinder, we'll go ahead and re-wet it, and we will go to a mid speed, but 12 to 1400 grit on the diamond blades. Continue to go across it. The essential part is using enough water. Too little water will allow the top of the concrete to essentially burn, so to speak, and it will pull up more issues than what are necessary to polish the top of the concrete. So we'll want to make sure that we're consistent in our pressure, consistent in our speed, and consistent with the 1200 grit with the adequate amount of water. No need to rush this. No need to increase the speed. It will take care of itself over multiple passes over the concrete countertop. Add additional water and continue to polish, feeling it periodically to ensure that we're getting a smooth finish that is a little bit milky feeling. You should be able to feel the Portland kind of between your fingers, and then you will know that you are smearing it into any of the little gaps that might have existed from air or aggregate being removed from the concrete countertop itself during the screeding process. Once complete with the polishing, we'll let it dry overnight and then remove the forms. Once the forms are removed, you're going to notice afterwards some pockets have been exposed in the concrete countertop. Some little tiny holes, and some of them might be big, from aggregate being removed during the polishing process. So now we're going to fill the top with a combination of Portland, acrylic fortifier, and water. The measurements on this are rather specific to get the best bond to the concrete countertop. So use 2 pounds of Portland and no less than 2 ounces of acrylic fortifier. Once you have mixed that up with the water, you can then smear it into any areas that have any pockmarks or any areas that have had any issues with aggregate or sand coming to the top, or aggregate falling out, or anything that has any air pocket. We want this solution to be rather watery so that it'll fill in any of those pockets, but don't sacrifice on the amount of acrylic fortifier or the amount of Portland. If it is too wet with too much water, it'll still work, but not enough acrylic fortifier will cause it to not adhere completely to the existing concrete countertop. And then those pockmarks will then again pop out. So pay special attention to that when mixing it, and mix it thoroughly. Also, you can just use gloves to smear this around, as we're just filling in tiny little pockets around the whole entire countertop. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a trowel, and there's no specific method, but you do want to make it as thin as possible on the covering, because when we go on to the next stage and we polish, we're going to have to polish 90+% of that off. Go around the sink perimeter, the grill perimeter, make sure that we don't miss any areas, and get ready for it to dry. And the next day, we'll sand it all off. Now that the entire countertop has been surfaced with the Portland solution and has been let to cure for 24 hours minimum, but no more than 2 weeks, we can now begin the polishing process. In this, you'll need plenty of water. Do not short yourself on the amount of water, and you will be using half the RPMs again on your polisher, but this time it's going to be with 1200 to 1400 grit diamond pads. It's up to you. Either one, 12 to 400, 1400, they work about the same. It might just take an additional pass. And you'll want to keep consistent pressure the entire time and a consistent amount of water. So you'll want to keep on re-wetting. And as you've done one pass, you'll want to water it down again, and continue on with another pass. So it will take a few passes to get through all of that Portland solution that has dried on there, but that Portland solution will have filled all of the pockets, all of the air gaps, any aggregate issues, and those will then remain full of Portland and allow you to actually have that smooth, polished feel that you'd expect from a concrete countertop. So as you can see, I have done one pass in a small part and wet it back down. But if you look closely, you can see the smearing of the Portland, and that's exactly what you want. It's referred to as butter. You want to butter the top of it and smear all of that new Portland that is coming up with the sanding all over the entire countertop. That's what's going to give you that nice polished look after we do a few more passes and a little more water. And periodically, you'll want to feel the top of the countertop just to make sure that that butter is, filling in any of those gaps and that you haven't exposed any additional air pockets or any additional aggregate has come and popped out of the surface. That would require adding additional Portland and or taking this slurry, this butter from the top, and smearing it into the cavity that's exposed from the aggregate popping out. But continue to add water and then continue to polish until you find the surface that feels the consistency that you would like. And then you will know on the remainder of the countertop, you want to do that same amount of passes and use approximately that same amount of water. With concrete countertops, there is no fixed way it's going to be or look or feel afterwards. We just want to make sure that we are filling in all of the gaps, as those are just going to get contaminants in them after they are a working countertop. And we want to make sure that it's a feel that you essentially like. So if you are satisfied with the feel of it, then you know that you can move on to another section. As you can see, we are now starting to see that smoother surface. And it's just a slow, patient procedure where we go over the entire surface over and over again with enough water, smearing that slurry into the top. Periodically feel the countertop just to ensure that you're getting close to the polished effect that you would like. Keep in mind it's going to be a little bit sandy, just as some of that Portland dries out there and some of that slurry dries out. But when you think you're just about there, do one more pass over. So add more water, do another pass over, just a slightly higher speed. So we're talking 2,000 RPM maximum. And afterwards, that sandy feel is going to come off with the final wash down of the countertop itself. Move around the entire surface and continue with the same amount of passes over every single section. We want it to be consistent, and you will be able to feel that consistency and see that consistency over time. Keep in mind this is one of the longest stages of the project, but it essentially defines what the finished product is going to look like. So really, patience is a virtue when it comes to doing concrete countertops. It takes time, but the product at the end is going to look amazing. Now that you've polished the entire concrete countertop, it may feel smooth, maybe slightly gritty, but it's going to be dusty looking and unattractive. So we are going to get all of that dust off with a spray down, and you may need to use a sponge or a rag to wipe some of that residue off and really get down to the polished surface before we do the staining of the concrete countertop itself. Many stains won't adhere to that residue, so very important that we get that off so you get the finished product that you're expecting. The stain adheres and penetrates and gives a beautiful finish. Now we're ready for the staining, and we will apply this with a pump sprayer. You can apply it with a rag, with a sponge. Depends on the type of stain that you're using. Don't get overwhelmed with all of the stains on the market. Just make sure that whatever you're doing is consistent on the countertop. I prefer a penetrating stain that is semi-transparent. It's cost effective and it'll show some of the natural characteristics of the concrete through the stained surface, whereas a solid stain will be just one solid color over the whole entire countertop. So that's just a personal preference. If you would like to see some of the rustic nature of the concrete, in this case I do. And then in some cases you just want it to be one solid color and want to change it away from the gray and make it say orange or red, whatever it is. There are several stains out there available. Some of them acid-based. Keep that in mind. If it is acid-based, that's going to affect the sealer that you're going to be able to use on it. So that's one reason I like the semi-transparent stain that has a little bit of pigment added to it. I could then go ahead and use a latex acrylic sealer and have no problems with there being a reaction that causes anything to peel up. Use a foam roller to get rid of any of the excess puddling from the stain. That way you'll get that transparent look that you're going for and see the exposed concrete underneath. Let that dry for a day and then we will seal the concrete countertop. In this case, we're going to use a latex acrylic sealer that is a surface sealer with high gloss. So it's not going to penetrate all the way. A very important note is to go with the lengthwise concrete. Use a quality brush and make sure that it is not over 90 degrees at the time of application and that the surface then is not over 90 degrees at the time of application. If it is, it will dry very quickly and it's going to leave the brush strokes. So you want it to be a thick enough layer that those brush strokes then lay down and have time to dry in cooler weather. Again, we want to be thorough, but we want to be quick as we don't want any dry edges meeting each other. In that, I mean that if you do a brush stroke, you want to make sure that you continue with those brush strokes as you go across the entire countertop. That way you don't have an area that is a little bit more high gloss and an area that is less high gloss. So if you're using a non-high gloss, say matte finish penetrating sealer, you won't have to worry about that as much at all because it's going to saturate into the concrete countertop itself. But when you have a surface where you're going to make it high gloss and the sealer is mainly going to sit on top of the countertop, you want to work quickly and in a cool environment so that all of the brush strokes, all of the areas where you've started and stopped, all mesh together. After the first coat is complete, do a second coat over it for ultra protection. This is gonna be just in case anything dings the top of the countertop, you have that extra sealer there, very thick layer because you've done two coats and you don't have to worry about anything then dinging the countertop, which would then result in a stain from maybe even just rain or plants and rain being on the countertop and or just a spill while you're doing a great family barbecue. Allow about 24 hours for the surface to dry. 72 hours would be complete curing time, but 24 hours will give you enough time to let it dry and still not hold up that barbecue or installing the barbecue grill itself or any other work you wanted to do around the surface.
All right. Well, that's a wrap on the project. Let's get a before and after and see what it cost us.
The beginnings of our outdoor kitchen and our finished outdoor kitchen. Amazing countertop, amazing stain job, great sealing job for $300.